Why hello there and welcome back to Let's Make Us a Character. However, before we begin, I do have a bit of sad news. While I was working on this video, James M. Ward, creator of Metamorphosis Alpha and Gamma World, as well as countless other contributions to tabletop gaming, passed away. And if you are watching this video, there is a pretty good chance that there are quite a few things you enjoy that wouldn't be the same or just wouldn't exist at all if James M. Ward had not thought that it would be cool if there was a sci-fi version of D&D and ended up having to be the one to make it. So, I would like to dedicate this episode to his memory and lasting legacy of weird and wacky games that he left behind. Games such as Gamma World, a property consistently ignored and mistreated by two successive publishers over the course of 45 years and 7 editions. With a release history that, when compared to Dungeons & Dragons, could be described as spotty at best, and only totals like 35 products in all. A sad fate for a game that is usually the first name that comes to mind when you say post-apocalyptic tabletop role-playing game. And as mentioned in the previous video, Gamma World is essentially a spiritual successor to Metamorphosis Alpha, which introduced many of the concepts that Gamma World would then standardize as the defining elements of the gonzo post-apocalyptic genre. Like, it would not be an exaggeration to call Gamma World the most important tabletop role-playing game that you've never played. So to begin, in this video I will be going over how to make character personae, a term that is used in the book and therefore, as you can understand, I just had to as well, for Gamma World 1st Edition from 1978, which is notably 1 year after Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. However, unlike that, which was a 128-page hardcover book with a separate monster manual, Gamma World was released as a box set with a map, dice, and 56-page all-in-one rulebook. And I'm not really going to get into the setting here because, as I mentioned, whatever you think of when I say weird post-apocalypse has likely been influenced directly or indirectly by Gamma World. So, with that out of the way, let's make us a Gamma World 1st Edition character. Characters have 6 attributes: mental strength, intelligence, dexterity, charisma, constitution, and physical strength. So, compared to Metamorphosis Alpha, the attributes have been standardized to be more consistent with those in Dungeons & Dragons. And we roll 3d6 for each attribute, although according to the book it is advisable to instead roll 4d6 and take the 3 highest results, as, quote, player characters represent an elite with a desire, the initiative, and the ability to venture outside the boundaries of the village, town, or tribal lands, and as such, should reasonably have above average stats. Kinda weird how old school games keep disagreeing with annoying old school gaming enthusiasts about how old school games were supposed to be played. And then we have 3 options for a character type: pure strain human, humanoid, and mutated animal. Mutated plants are still a thing, but are now specifically stated to not be appropriate for use as player characters. And there have been some notable changes here from Metamorphosis Alpha. Pure strain humans now get a +3 bonus to charisma instead of nothing, which is quite useful given that charisma determines whether or not someone is going to help you or stab you with a poison spear. But this is a Gamma World video, and you want me to talk about mutations, so we will not be going with pure strain human. Mutated animals have also been updated, and now have human-level intelligence by default instead of needing to spend one of your mutations on it. Possibly because there is now an intelligence attribute versus Metamorphosis Alpha, where creatures were either just intelligent or not. However, as in Metamorphosis Alpha, the rules state to figure out all of the animal's base abilities as logically and reasonably as possible before the start of the game to prevent later arguments, without providing any kind of guidelines on how to do that. And I do generally like to avoid having to fill in too many gaps myself in these videos, so let's just go with humanoid. who have not really undergone any changes from Metamorphosis Alpha, and in a weird way you could say that the humanoid mutants are kind of like the human option for Gamma World. They are the basic default, which is, weird when one of the other options is literally human. And as a mutated human, we do of course start just as a regular human. But before we get into any mutating, let's take a look at our attributes and what they do. Mental strength is used in making and resisting mental attacks. Just like in Metamorphosis Alpha, you reference the attacker and defender's mental strengths on the mental attack matrix to determine a 2-hit number for the attack. So, for example, with a mental strength of 12, if we were mental attacking a creature with a mental strength of 10, we would need to roll an 8 or higher on a d20 to succeed. And notably, that is a change from Metamorphosis Alpha, where it was 3d6 instead, which was presumably changed for reasons of consistency, and also that being kinda weird. Also, you do still increase your mental strength by 1 for each 5 mental attacks successfully resisted, but now also for every 5 successful attacks made. Intelligence is used in determining if a character is able to operate artifacts, gaining a -1 adjustment for every point of intelligence above 15, or +1 for every point under 7 to attempts to do so. So at Intelligence 17, we get a -2 adjustment. Also, the process for doing that has become moderately more complex and will be explained later. Dexterity determines who acts first in combat and also grants a +1 for each point above 15 or -1 for each point under 6 to 2 hit rolls in physical combat, neither of which applies to us. Charisma is weirdly important here compared to the universal dump stat that it sometimes is seen at in Dungeons & Dragons. It determines our maximum number of followers, in our case with a charisma of 8, 3, morale adjustment, which is -1, and reaction adjustment, which is just normal. And basically, the way reaction works is when an NPC's reaction to the character is unsure, the GM rolls 2d6 and consults the reaction table to determine their attitude, adding that reaction modifier to the roll, if applicable. And just because that wasn't complicated enough, all those charisma-based stats are further modified by character type modifiers. So as a humanoid, we take -2, -1, and -1 to our max followers, reaction modifier, and morale respectively when dealing with pure stock humans or mutated animals. Constitution determines hit points, so with a constitution of 11, we get 11d6, so 43 hit points. And yes, rolling up that many hit points at first level is very satisfying. Constitution also determines the effects of poison by cross-referencing the character's constitution versus the strength of the poison. So with a constitution of 11, we would be unaffected by poisons of 7 or lower, take 1 or 2 dice damage from strength 8 or 9 poisons respectively, and die from anything stronger. Yeah, poison is just as brutal as it was in Metamorphosis Alpha. Although now antidotes have been simplified a bit more so that they work on the strength of the poison. So if we are taken out by a strength 12 poison, all we need to be saved is a general strength 12 antidote, as long as it's administered within 2 rounds. But the big change here is that Constitution now also determines radiation resistance, since there is no longer a dedicated radiation resistance attribute as there was in Metamorphosis Alpha. And it is basically handled the same as poison, cross-referencing your constitution and the radiation level on a matrix. So with 11 constitution, we take 3 to 8 d6 damage per round for intensity 3 to 8 radiation, gain a random mutation on a 9 or 10, and die on anything above that. Although there is still a 20% chance of just gaining a negative mutation instead of dying. But some of those are very, very bad. Also, radiation has gotten a bit more deadly just in general. For example, with a constitution of 11 and level 11 radiation, in Metamorphosis Alpha we would take 1d6 damage. In Gamma World, we would die. And finally, physical strength, which grants a +1 bonus for each point above 15 or -1 for each point under 6 to damage in physical combat, which at 10 is another no adjustment for us. And that is what the attributes do, on paper at least. Of course, you can also use them as a rough measure of a character's abilities, so, a character with strength 15 can reasonably just lift more stuff than a character with strength of 5. Or you can test them if desired. My preferred method is a d20 roll under, but as I said in the Metamorphosis Alpha video, that is a thing that is really only a feature if you already know which additional mechanics to use. Overall, it is just one of those games were designed and written differently in 1978 type things that to me very much screams old school game design, having attributes that do a specific thing each rather than all attributes doing a standardized thing, which may then be applied to other specific things. But now that we've gotten all of that out of the way, we can talk about what you came here for, the wacky mutations. So, just like in Metamorphosis Alpha, we roll 1d4 each for our physical and mental mutations, and 2 and 2. And there are two options for generating mutations. Either we can select them, in which case additional defects are added. In our case, it would be one mental or physical defect for having 2 of each mutation type, or we can roll for the mutations, which does not add any additional defects. However, the defects are now just on the regular mutation table, so hypothetically we could roll more defects than just taking the 1, or we could roll no defects. Or we could roll all defects. But we all know that I love rolling, so we are going to do that. Also notable is that there is now a single shared mutation table list for both humanoid and animal mutants, versus Metamorphosis Alpha where there were a handful of mutant animal exclusive mutations. Although there is still a wide selection of plant exclusive mutations. So let's roll, and Ultravision, which lets us see ultraviolet emissions, radiation, mental powers, electricity, and other such things not normally visible to the human eye. And new body part, which allows us to have some kind of new body part of our choosing, and just to get the most out of our Ultravision, let's say eye stalks for enhanced eye mobility. And now for mental mutations, multiple damage, which makes us psychosomatically take double or triple damage. And since I'm technically the GM here, I'll just say double. Yeah, these are the sorts of things that can happen when you let the dice decide. And finally, cryokinesis, which allows us to manipulate temperature to freeze things within 25 meters. And unfortunately, I could not find a set of rules for rolling up additional aesthetic mutations like I did for Metamorphosis Alpha, but then I did remember that I literally wrote up Gamma World style mutants as a Pathfinder player race back in 2014, including a set of tables for additional aesthetic mutations, so I'll just use those. And there we go, that is one mutanty mutant. And since this was 1978 and also a 56-page rule booklet in a box set, starting wealth and equipment isn't exactly a standardized thing. You just kind of get whatever the GM gives you, so let's just say the character is wearing furs or skins, which gives an AC of 8, and this is a descending AC where the lowest is 10 and the highest is 1. And I think she could reasonably have a dagger, which has a weapon class of 2, which is like an armor class but for weapons, and deals 1d4 damage against man-sized or smaller targets, and 1d3 against larger. Also, I think we really need to bring back man-sized as a size reference. And speaking of equipment, let's talk about artifacts, because I said earlier that I would explain how they worked later, and now it is later and I am. So let's say that we have found some kind of thing which is in fair condition, and we want to try and figure out what is that thing. We pull up the appropriate artifact use and operation chart, and starting in the box marked S, roll a d10, subtracting 2 for our high intelligence, and then following the arrows to the next box, and so on, and so on, and so on, until such time as we reach the box marked F, at which point we have determined what the thing is and how to use it, and in this case it is a laser pistol. However, just because we figured out what it is and how it works, doesn't necessarily mean that it does work. As a fair condition item, there is a 40% chance that it actually functions. And yes. So, identification of items really just takes time. What we did here would have taken like 2 hours in-game. That, and of course the risk of hurting yourself or someone else nearby if you happen to get to that skull and crossbones, which, depending on the artifact in question, could be bad for something like a laser pistol, or very bad for something like a neutron bomb. And if you think this system is complex yet pointless, this is just chart A. This is chart C. And this is the advanced version from the Dragon. Anyway, our new laser pistol has a weapon class of 13 and deals 5d6 damage. And then also, for finding and identifying and learning to use this laser pistol, we gain 1,000 experience points. And this character is done. But now, let's see what else this character can do. Like, say if they happen to encounter a random fungus creature that I rolled up. So in a combat scenario, the first thing we do is compare dexterity scores to see who goes first, and it is our character, who will activate her cryokinesis, which as a mental mutation is presumably a mental combat, meaning that we need to cross-reference our mental strength against the targets on the mental attack matrix. And we need to roll a 7, which we do, dealing 1d6 cold damage per round of undisturbed concentration, which is just 1d6 now because this is the first round, but it can go up to 10 dice at the 10th round. Unfortunately, we are immediately disturbed by the abomination of fungal flesh launching a poison throwing thorn. And in a nice addition here, there is now a specific attack matrix for natural attacks based on creature hit dice. So we reference the creature's 10 hit dice versus our AC of 8 for a 2-hit number of 8, which is a success, and the throwing thorn deals damage as a dagger, which we have established deals 1d4 damage versus man-sized targets, so 3 damage. Except that we take double damage, so 6. However, poison thorns also have poison, unsurprisingly. So we also need to pull up the poison matrix and check our constitution of 11 versus the poison's strength of 9. And take 2 more dice of damage for another 9, or rather 18 damage. And given that the situation is not going exactly as we had hoped, the only real reasonable course of action here is lasers. So we reference the laser pistol's weapon class of 13 versus the Mushloon's armor class of 7 and have a 2-hit number of 8, which we easily hit, dealing 5d6, so 21 laser damage. And because that drops the Mushloon's hit points under half, it must make a morale check, rolling a d10 and fleeing on any result under 5, which it fails and is out of here. And for our heroic victory over the creature, we are awarded a number of experience points equal to its total hit points, so 36. And just for convenience, let's say that that happens to push us over 3,000 total experience points, which just happens to be the number needed to get our first bonus. So we roll a d10 and +1 charisma, which increases our maximum followers by 1 and removes our morale penalty. And of course there are some other things like fatigue rules that don't really come into play until the 11th round of combat at the earliest, but for the purposes of this video, that is Gamma World 1st Edition. Basically just a refinement of Metamorphosis Alpha, but one that I think is an improvement in pretty much every area. I still prefer the uniqueness of the Metamorphosis Alpha setting, but I think what that comes down to is that something of a perceived lack of uniqueness in Gamma World from a modern perspective just comes down to how influential it was on the very specific genre of wacky post-apocalypse. Like, without Gamma World, would we really have Fallout, Robot Holocaust, or After the Bomb? Okay, I realize that last one might be better if we didn't have it, but the others are good. And it is a game that is that influential despite receiving almost no support from its publishers. Like, there were a total of 4 first edition Gamma World products, but somehow it managed to just keep coming back for another 6 editions. 3 more from TSR, and then the mess that Wizards of the Coast makes of everything. So with 6 more editions to get through, next time we will be making a Gamma World 2nd edition character, because as stated previously, that is how numbers work. And thank you for watching, with extra special thanks to my Fight and Flail Snails, Broken Unicorn, Randy Mulholland, and Toshiro Okuro. If you'd like to be cool like them, check out my Patreon, where you can get early access to videos and fun stuff that I make for the Patreon. But if you don't want to do that, that's cool too. You can still hit all the lovely buttons, like, subscribe, these other videos that either myself or the cold, heartless YouTube algorithm have lovingly selected for you, which I'm sure are lovely videos that you will also enjoy. And I will see you next time.